Imagine paying a week's wages for a handful of black pepper, not gold, not silver. Pepper. In the 15th century, spices weren't luxury items. They were survival, status, and power. And Europe had a problem. They had the money, but they didn't control the supply. Every grain of spice came from the east, and every route to that east was controlled by someone else. So, Europe made a decision that would change the world. They would find their own way to India. To understand why Europe was so desperate, you first need to understand what life actually looked like in medieval Europe. There was no refrigeration, no preservatives, no cold storage. If you slaughtered a cow in October, that meat had to last through winter. Without something to preserve it and mask the rot, people got sick. People died. Spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon didn't just make food taste better. They made food survivable. But spices weren't just about food. They were medicine. Doctors prescribed cloves for toothaches, pepper for digestion, cinnamon for fevers. If you were sick in 1400s Europe, spices were your pharmacy. And then there was status. If you could put pepper on your table, you were someone. Nobles competed to serve the most exotic spices at their banquets. It was the Renaissance version of showing off a luxury car. The more spice on your table, the more powerful you looked. So pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these weren't cooking ingredients. They were currency. They were medicine. They were power. And all of them came from one place, the East. From India and the islands of Southeast Asia, thousands of miles away from Europe. Now here's the problem. Spices didn't just magically appear in European markets. They traveled an incredibly long and complicated journey to get there. It started in the spice farms of India and the Maluku Islands, a small chain of islands in present-day Indonesia, which Europeans would later call the Spice Islands. Farmers there grew the pepper, harvested the cloves, dried the nutmeg. Then local traders bought it from them and loaded it onto ships. Those ships crossed the Indian Ocean to ports in Arabia and Persia. Arab merchants, who had mastered these sea routes for centuries, picked up the goods. They were brilliant traders. They knew the winds, the seasons, and the ports. And they kept their trade routes a closely guarded secret. From Arabia, the spices moved overland. Camel caravans carried them through Persia, through the deserts of the Middle East, into the ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, and at every single stop along the way, someone took a cut, a tax here, a toll there, a merchant's profit in the middle. By the time a bag of pepper reached Venice or Genoa in Italy, its price had multiplied 10, 20, sometimes 30 times over. And the Europeans at the end of this chain? They had no choice but to pay, because they couldn't go around it. They didn't know the routes. They didn't have the maps. They were completely dependent on this chain of middlemen, and the middlemen knew it. For a long time, Europe tolerated this situation. Expensive? Yes. Unfair? Absolutely. But it worked. The spices kept flowing, even if Europeans had to bleed money for every shipment. Then, in 1453, everything changed. The Ottoman Empire, a powerful Muslim empire rising in the Middle East, launched a massive military campaign against Constantinople. Constantinople was not just any city. It was the gateway between Europe and Asia. It sat at the exact point where the land routes from the east met the Western world. It was the most strategically important city on earth. And the Ottomans took it. After a siege that lasted nearly 2 months, the walls of Constantinople, walls that had stood for over 1,000 years, finally fell. For Europe, this was a catastrophe, not just a political or military defeat, but an economic one as well. The Ottomans now controlled the land routes, and they were not interested in giving Europeans a smooth, cheap, easy path to Eastern goods. Taxes on trade went up, access became restricted, some routes were shut completely. The price of spices in European cities didn't just rise, it exploded. In some places, pepper became so scarce that it was used to pay rents and settle debts, like physical cash. The situation was unsustainable. Europe was bleeding wealth. Something had to change. The question that started forming in the minds of European rulers was simple, but terrifying. What if we go around? Not through the Middle East, not through Ottoman territory. What if there was a sea route, going south, around Africa, and then east, directly to India? No middlemen, no Ottoman taxes, no Arab merchants keeping secrets. Just open ocean and direct trade. It sounded insane. In the 1400s, the ocean wasn't a highway. It was a graveyard. Sailors genuinely believed that beyond certain points, the sea boiled, that monsters lived in the deep, that ships would fall off the edge of the world. Maps ended with warnings. Here be dragons. And Africa? Nobody in Europe knew how far South Africa went, or if it even had an end. The continent looked enormous, and the journey looked impossible. But one small kingdom on the western edge of Europe decided to try anyway. Not England, not France, not the powerful Italian city-states. A small, relatively poor country that most people today wouldn't guess as the starting point of the age of exploration. Portugal. Portugal had advantages that most people don't think about. It sat on the southwestern tip of Europe, right on the Atlantic Ocean. The sea was their backyard. And then there was one man who turned this into a national mission, Prince Henry, known to history as Henry, the Navigator. Henry was not an explorer himself. He never sailed on the great voyages. But he was something arguably more powerful. He was an organizer, a funder, a true believer. He set up what was essentially the world's first research institute for ocean exploration at Sagres on the southern tip of Portugal. He brought together the best mapmakers, astronomers, mathematicians, and sailors from across Europe and the Arab world. He had one goal: figure out how to sail south along Africa's coast and find out where it ends. Year after year, he sent ships down the African coast. Each voyage went a little further than the last. Each captain came back with new information, new coastlines, new winds, new stars to navigate by. Henry collected all of it, mapped it, used it to plan the next voyage. It was slow, grinding, methodical work, and it took decades. Henry died in 1460 without ever finding a route to India. But he had built something that outlasted him. Knowledge, maps, techniques, a generation of sailors trained for long ocean voyages. Portugal didn't stop when Henry died. If anything, they accelerated. The Portuguese didn't find the route to India on their first or second or their 10th try. For decades, their ships crept down the African coast. Each voyage was dangerous. Many sailors died. Many ships were lost. Some captains turned back when the coast seemed to go on forever with no end in sight. There was also the problem of the equator. European sailors had never crossed it. They genuinely didn't know what would happen. Would the sun be so intense that it burned the sea? Would the stars disappear and leave them completely lost? When Portuguese ships finally crossed the equator and came back alive, it was treated like a scientific breakthrough. Slowly, painfully, they mapped the African coast. And then, in 1488, a Portuguese captain named Bartolomeu Dias did something that changed everything. His ships were caught in a colossal storm near the southern tip of Africa, a storm that lasted 13 straight days. They lost sight of land completely. When the skies finally cleared, Dias turned east to find the coastline, but there was nothing there. The coast had disappeared. He had accidentally been pushed past the tip of Africa entirely. He turned north and found open water leading into a completely different ocean, the Indian Ocean. He had done it. Africa had an end. The route existed. But Dias never reached India. His crew was broken, exhausted, starving, on the verge of full mutiny. They forced him to turn back. On the journey home, he saw the jagged cliffs at Africa's southern tip for the first time and named it the Cape of Storms, because of the terrifying weather that had nearly sunk his fleet. The Portuguese king later renamed it something more hopeful, the Cape of Good Hope, because now they had proof, and now they had hope. Almost 10 years passed after Dias rounded the Cape. 10 years of preparation, politics, and planning. Portugal knew the route existed, but sending a fleet all the way to India was a different challenge entirely. It required the right ships, the right supplies, and the right captain. In 1497, Portugal finally felt ready. And the man King Manuel chose to lead the expedition was Vasco da Gama. Da Gama was not the most senior officer in Portugal. He wasn't the most famous. He was in his 30s, relatively unknown, but deeply trusted by the king. He was known for being tough, ruthless when necessary, and completely unbreakable under pressure. Da Gama set sail from Lisbon on July 8, 1497, with 4 ships and around 170 men. But then he made a decision that looked like madness. Instead of following the African coast all the way south, like every captain before him, he swung his fleet out into the open Atlantic, far west, away from land, away from any coastline. He was chasing wind patterns that Portuguese sailors had slowly learned about over decades. By swinging deep into the Atlantic, he could catch powerful trade winds that would carry him all the way around to southern Africa faster than any coastal route. It worked, but it came at a cost. For 93 days, Da Gama's crew saw nothing but open ocean. No birds, no land, no fresh water, just horizon in every direction. To put that in perspective, Christopher Columbus, when he crossed the Atlantic to reach the Americas, was out of sight of land for 33 days. That alone nearly drove his crew to mutiny. Da Gama's men spent 93 days in the open ocean, nearly 3 times as long, with no guarantee of what lay on the other side. Then came the storms near the Cape of Good Hope, waves the size of buildings, winds so powerful that men were swept off the decks. And then came something worse than any storm: scurvy. Without vitamin C, the sailors' bodies began to break down from the inside. Their gums swelled until the flesh covered their teeth, making it impossible to eat. Old wounds that had healed years ago reopened on their own. Their legs turned black with deep bruising. Men lay in the dark below deck, in pain, waiting to either recover or die. And through all of this, the storms, the scurvy, the dying crew, there was a near mutiny. Sailors begged Da Gama to turn back. His response was completely characteristic of the man. He had the ringleaders arrested, threw their navigation equipment into the sea so they couldn't plot a course home themselves, and told the crew, simply and coldly, "We are going forward." Once past the Cape, Da Gama entered a world that European sailors had never seen: the East African coast, Swahili trading cities, Mozambique, Mombasa, Malindi, wealthy, sophisticated ports connected to an Indian Ocean trade network that had existed for centuries. These were not primitive villages. They were cosmopolitan cities where Arab, Persian, African, and Indian merchants all traded side by side. Da Gama was not welcomed everywhere. In some ports, local Arab traders, who immediately understood that the Portuguese were a threat to their business, poisoned the local rulers against him. In Mombasa, tensions boiled over completely, and Da Gama fired his cannons at the city before fleeing. But in Malindi, he found what he desperately needed: a navigator, an experienced Indian Ocean pilot who knew the monsoon winds, the stars of the southern hemisphere, and the sea routes to India in his bones. With this man guiding the fleet, the crossing of the entire Indian Ocean took just 23 days, and on May 20th, 1498, 10 months after leaving Lisbon, Vasco da Gama's fleet arrived on the shores of Calicut, on the southwest coast of India. Today, that city is called Kozhikode, in the state of Kerala. Europe had found its sea route to India. Da Gama went ashore expecting to be received like an ambassador from a great power. Instead, it was an embarrassment. When he presented his gifts to the Zamorin, the ruler of Calicut, the court officials looked at what he had brought and laughed. Striped cloth, hats, strings of coral beads, jars of honey. Calicut was a city that had traded with China, Arabia, and Persia for centuries. They had seen silk, gold, fine porcelain, and genuine treasures. Da Gama had arrived like a poor guest at a rich man's party. The Zamorin asked a question that cut right through everything. If you come from a great kingdom, why did you bring nothing of value? The Arab traders already in Calicut worked against him at every step, warning the Zamorin that the Portuguese were not merchants, but pirates. Trade negotiations collapsed. Da Gama left India without the grand treaty he had come for. When he finally returned to Lisbon in 1499, he had lost 2 of his 4 ships and more than half his men. But he had the spices. The pepper and cinnamon he brought back sold for 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. 60 times. Portugal had proven that the route worked. The middlemen could be bypassed. The monopoly could be broken. Within a decade, Portugal returned, not with trade goods this time, but with warships. They didn't ask for treaties. They seized ports. They blockaded trade routes. They built forts on foreign shores. The Indian Ocean, which had been a free and open trading zone for 1,000 years, began to fall under European control. The age of colonialism had begun, and it began here, driven by the price of black pepper. But here is what history often forgets. India was not discovered. India was not lost. India was already one of the richest, most connected civilizations on Earth, trading with China, Arabia, and Africa long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. What Vascodagama found was not India. He found a route. A sea route that shifted the balance of the entire world. A route that moved power from the land to the oceans. A route that would eventually bring Europe to India's shores, not as traders, but as conquerors. What did India think of all this? How did the greatest civilization on Earth respond to these strange armed ships arriving uninvited at its ports? And what happened next? That is the next chapter.